Let's begin. Okay, those of you who are here, we're going to start with you all. And glad you're here, glad we can be together for this event, Global Church Conference with a focus on climate care and the people of God. And we're so thankful for what we heard in worship from Danielle, and we'll hear more as she's on the panel as well, along with several others. The plan is to think critically and thoughtfully about climate change and how that affects us and how we as a body of people of faith can help relieve the situation and maybe move in new directions. I want to thank a couple of people before we actually get started. One is Kamal. Kamal was here earlier in our worship service. Kamal and Sojourner Truth have partnered with us for the last several years in creating our Global Church Conference, and we're so thankful for them. And New College Berkeley has also participated with us in the last several years in co-sponsoring this event. Tim and Craig are the new co-directors. Susan Phillips worked with us numerous years to be able to put this conference on, and so we're thankful for all of them. It started actually in 2005, about 18 years ago. There was a desire for the Berkeley Church, and I'm not sure this has really happened, but the Berkeley Church to get out of its Berkeley bubble. You can tell me if that's happened. What the goal is to try and listen to voices in the majority world to help us understand our own discipleship and to help us understand what's happening impactfully in Christianity throughout the world. And those voices then we wanted to hear. This year, we're listening to those voices, but we're also trying to say this is an important discussion because it affects not one person, but all people, not one location, but everywhere. And so we felt like this would be a good follow-up on our last 2 years of focus on racial justice. If you're anything like some of us, our purpose here, we want you to know, is not necessarily to debate, or it's not necessarily to convince, but it's to lay out both scientific and faith-based issues on how we together come together to be more informed, be more motivated, be more encouraged about how we can address this particular complicated issue. So the plan for the day is that I'm welcoming you. Welcome again. Glad you're all here. William is going to come in just a moment and kick off our panel discussion. When William is done, William Morris, when he is finished, Charlene, Reverend Dr. Charlene Hahn Powell, our senior pastor, head of staff, yes. She is going to come. She's a masterful moderator, and she's going to come and moderate the questions and the discussion at that point. So we'll hear from her in just a few moments. What happened this year is that we had plans for people to come, one of whom was Nettie Ostudio, who lives actually in Florida in the Tampa Bay area. And she had to back out, as you can be well aware of, back out just this last week. And so we thought, okay, what are we going to do? Do we pull somebody else in, or do we have somebody take over somehow? Her suggestion was to have William Morris come. He's from Southern California, educated at Humboldt State in science, and is a faith-based organizer, is working with Nettie in Green Faith around the world. William himself has been in numerous places around the world working on climate issues. And so we were so thrilled. We called him, and he was able to come and be with us today. And so here he is. So in a minute, you'll get to meet him and hear from him. He is what is called a faith organizer. That is, he works with faith communities. As I mentioned, in Green Faith, which is working around the world, it's a grassroots, multi-faith movement for climate justice. But he also is a member and on the steering committee of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, I think it is. Yeah, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. But he also is part of California Interfaith Power and Light, the Creation Care Committee for Faith United Methodist Church, Faiths for Future, and Circle of Faith and Future, and on it goes. He's speaking to us today from his experience as a science major at Humboldt State, but also as a person of faith. And we are so glad that you can be with us, William. Come and share with us what God has on your heart and how you have worked in this particular field. Okay?
Well, thank you for coming back after lunch, everyone. It's great to see you again. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for the generous introduction, Tom. I'm definitely all over the place all the time and just happened to have this weekend open, and now I know why. It was because I was supposed to be here. I want to thank Pastor Danielle for that amazing sermon this morning. And the only other time I've seen her was at COP26 in Scotland. I was also part of the Christian Climate Observer Program, and we connected there, and very excited to connect again here in this beautiful, beautiful place. As Tom said, I went to Humboldt State, and so I would pass through the Bay Area on the way, and it was one of my favorite stops, and so I'm really glad to be here today. And we definitely want to keep Nettie, in our prayers, and it's unfortunate how the climate crisis is affecting us here and now. It affected this event. And speaking of, where are we now with the climate? Daniel kind of covered this earlier, and things seem to be getting more and more dire by the day. We seem to set new heat, rainfall, and wildfire records on the regular. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports has issued its bleakest warning yet on our climate. California's been dealing with brutal record-breaking heat waves, as so much as the rest of the world all over the place is dealing with these record-breaking heat waves. And Hurricane Fiona recently knocked out power to all of Puerto Rico, who is still recovering from the last hurricane. And that hurricane made it all the way up into Canada and made landfall. And as we know, Hurricane Ian now hit Cuba hard, knocking out power to the entire island. And then we've seen, I'm sure, many of the pictures of the devastation in Florida. And we have fossil fuel companies who are having record profits by gouging prices. I saw the gas prices here, they're the same as back home. Quite crazy. And COP27, which is coming up in Egypt, the UN's annual climate conference, just announced that Coca-Cola, the world's number one plastic polluter, is going to be a sponsor of this year's conference. And so it seems like the world and the earth isn't doing so hot, well, it is too hot, and that is our problem. And that is just such a minuscule snapshot of what's going on right now. And we're here as Christians and people of faith, and so let's go back to our creation story and ground ourselves and remind us what is our role in relation to the earth. And Pastor Danielle covered some of this, and I'm going to echo some of the truth that she has given us. Starting in Genesis 2, we see that God formed humans from the soil of the ground and breathed life into them, and humans became a living creature. And then God planted a garden, Eden, in the east, and put the human who they had formed there to take care of it, to look after it, to guard it, and to keep it. And the meaning of soil or ground in Hebrew is Adamah. And so the name Adam literally means children of the earth. In the Christian creation story, we come from the soil. And to the soil we shall return. That is what's remembered on Ash Wednesday. in preparation for Lent and the culmination of new life that is celebrated during Easter. Here in Genesis 2, it tells us that the vocation of the children of the earth is to cultivate and to care for this earth. We are to work to keep it in balance. But it also tells us something else important, that we are made of the earth itself. We often think of ourselves as spiritual beings, detached from the problems of this earth. And we, in recent times, are seeing more and more how untrue that is, that the matters of earth concern us. Matter matters. And when we think of ourselves as part of the earth, it really changes everything. We don't just live here on the earth, but we as humans are earth. And I want to echo this truth in another way. I'm going to read a quote from Dr. Keolu Fox. He is Kanaka Maoli, which means he is Native Hawaiian. He also has a PhD in genome sciences. His research interests include genome sequencing, evolutionary genetics, and paleogenetics. So he really knows what he's talking about. And he made the following statement. He says, "The land itself and the conditions of the land, like altitude and climate, impact our genome just as our human ancestors do. We are born on it, die on it, we come from it, and return to it. The land is a part of us, a relative in a very real way. Stones are relatives. Whatever I eat has been taken up from nutrients in the ground, including minerals, and the stones and the land become a part of me. The thunderstorm and the rivers become a part of me. The land has absorbed the blood and sweat of generations, watched babies become old men and women and return to the earth, return to the waters. We are part of each other. Civilizations rise and fall, and the land continues. It holds the memory of us all, standing before a presence that large and old, and making one-sided claims of ownership is an act of extraordinary hubris." I mean, wow. Where we are, this earth makes up who we are. A powerful statement. And this parallels our creation story about us being children of the earth. The wisdom has been there all along, waiting for us to notice that we come from the earth, and to the earth we shall return. And so what does this newfound knowledge or old-found knowledge mean for us in this age of climate crisis, where those who've contributed the least to the crisis suffer the effects first and worst, where there are prophetic voices ringing alarm bells, and they're often ignored or tokenized while no meaningful action is taken? How do we respond? And luckily, the solution is something we're already familiar with, and that Pastor Danielle mentioned this morning. We can sum it up by being a good neighbor. And we want to expand that definition. Taking care of each other is taking care of the earth, and taking care of the earth helps take care of each other, because it is one and the same. To be a good neighbor is to make sure your neighbor has enough food to eat, fresh water to drink, clean air to breathe, and land in which to be in a relationship with. To be a good neighbor is also to speak up and fight against unjust laws and systems that oppress them. To be a good neighbor means stopping pipelines across stolen indigenous land. It means shuttering refineries that poison Black and brown neighborhoods. It means being subversive and doing the right thing to help others and our earth, even when it cuts into the profits of these exploitive corporations and the powers that be. As people of faith, this should convict us. We are always meant to do the right thing, no matter what, no matter the cost, even to ourselves. And so being a good neighbor means taking individual and systemic actions, both and, not either or. And so when congregations and people come up to me, what do we do? Well, I will turn the question around and say, what gifts and passions does this congregation and community have? What needs do they have? What needs are on your doorstep and in your community? Being a good neighbor means being place-based and relationship-based. The plants whose roots grow the deepest flourish the most. And so we can look to the wisdom of creation, to the creation that was here before us in the creation story. We are made last. And so the rest of creation is oftentimes our teacher. And no matter how hard it seems, the future is thankfully not written. There's still time to act. There's always hope. Every action we take is a pen stroke in the future we are collectively writing together. Even with the often demoralizing news of the latest climate report, the latest news segments, the latest climate-intensified natural disaster, it's clearer than ever what we need to do. We need to stop business as usual. We have to reduce our emissions, stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. We have the solutions we need. We just have to get those in power to implement them. And why? Well, because oftentimes, as we know, those in power don't do the right thing out of the goodness of their own hearts. They must be made to do it by people like you. And so we are called to fulfill the vocation that Creator has given us through prayer and through protest. This is Berkeley, isn't it? Through being a good neighbor. Every act is an act of hope, and change does happen. For example, just earlier this year in January, there was a huge win in Los Angeles, where I'm from. For over a decade, communities living on the front lines of neighborhood oil drilling. This is oil drilling happening near people's homes, near people's schools, churches, hospitals. They fought back. They realized the negative health impacts, the rates of cancer and respiratory disease and all of these different things that were impacting them. And together, in a coalition of families, community groups, houses of worship, organizations, they raised enough awareness. They caused enough good trouble around the dangers and health impacts their communities were facing. We saw Daniel's map earlier of the Bay Area, and that these impacts are not equitably distributed. And so these communities, these neighbors, these regular people pressured our city council in Los Angeles over and over again for a decade until they were made to do the right thing and to phase out oil drilling in the entire city of Los Angeles. When we work together, change is not just possible, it is inevitable. Especially when we are talking about faith communities, when we were talking about the moral voice. When we raise our voices, people listen. We can each partake in the birth of a more just and equitable world for everyone. Every generation is called to help midwife the earth through these labor pains and bring about new life. And I use that language very intentionally because Scripture even talks about this in Romans 8. It says, "For creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. And so these verses tell us that not only is creation groaning in the pains of childbirth, but so are we. And if you're someone who has given birth, you know that pain better than anyone. But why? Why are we as humans feeling the same childbirthing pain as creation? Why are we striving for the birth of new life? Well, because as we know from the creation story and the quote from Dr. Fox, we are the earth as well. We are the earth as well. The fate of the earth is our fate. We are one. And from those verses, I want to offer this thought that the redemption of our bodies is dependent on our response to creation's childbirthing groans. Our redemption is in helping birth the world that Creator intended versus the one it has been subjected to by a handful of exploitive and corrupt people looking to make a profit. Redemption for the earth means redemption and hope for us, and vice versa. When we talk about God's kingdom and this ideal world, we are supposed to help birth it here and now. And how do we know the steps to take to bring about such a world? It seems like a tall order. Well, the life of Jesus isn't a bad place to look. Jesus, someone who is in solidarity with the marginalized, the oppressed, and outcast, someone who caused so much good trouble and threatened the unjust powers that be to the point where he was crucified by the empire that had colonized his people. But as we know, new life would have the last word. In God's kingdom, the first will be last, and the last will be first. Those who have put profits above people, those who have put greed above an earth imbalance will be last. And as Danielle said earlier, those who we must most listen to are those being affected now. These communities who our society, who our empire has put last, whose needs are not being met, those who are suffering the most, those are the ones who we as Christians are called to put first. And I look around at all the people who are here. This is a beautiful congregation. And all the people who've come together today because you care, because you're curious, because you're asking questions. Today is a good day. What about tomorrow? And the next day? And the week after that? How will sustained action and imagination become our spiritual practice? What is this new life that we can imagine together? A better world that we can weave together. It's really, really an exciting thought. And some of the ways Green Faith and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action do that is by lifting up those voices, the most vulnerable. We are not going outside of our Christian vocation to do this. We are doing this because of our faith. We're doing this because our faith calls us to this, to those most in need. Just as Jesus met the needs of those most vulnerable in his time, we are called to do the same here today. The earth from which we are made is calling out to us. These childbirthing groans that Scripture says. This anticipation of new life mixed with the pain of transition. And we must have the moral courage to answer. Oftentimes people tell me they feel helpless and they feel like they can't make a difference. I'm just one person. What do I do? But no one has the friends, the family, the congregation, the job, the school, the circle of influence that you do. When you put together all of the factors of our life, each one of you is truly unique. We have purpose, and you are the perfect person to reach out to those around you. Oftentimes people will say, I don't know the science, I don't know enough. That's okay, that's settled. We know what's happening. We know it's us. We know it's bad, and we know there's things we can do. The most important thing you can do is talk about it. The most important thing you can do is bring it up in your circles and realize how it is affecting the people around you, the people in your own communities. Oftentimes we don't know how people are affected until we ask them. Many times we leave people to suffer in silence because we won't raise our voices. We don't want to disrupt the status quo. But you are the perfect person to do that in your circles, and I I want you to feel empowered to do that, even if you don't feel like you know what you're doing. At Green Faith, so much of our on-the-ground work is done by grassroots volunteers, people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, people who are older and retired and have the time on their hands to continue to act out their faith, young people who have no choice, because if they don't, what kind of future will they have? All this change we are seeing, all of this positive change is coming from people just like you, people who are willing to raise their voices and to cause a ruckus. And in a storied place like this, who has a history of pushing the status quo, there's no more perfect place for this work to be done. And that work can be done in many ways, through prayer, through protest, and through being a good neighbor. And that's all from me. I will turn the mic over to Pastor Charlene.
Thank you so much, Will. So I don't know about you, I want to hear more from him, so I'm going to have him sit down and join the panel. We're going to maximize the time we have with you, so feel free to take a seat. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I was telling Danielle that looking at that picture of her and her daughter at the march, one of the most powerful things about doing something like protesting or a march is just looking around you and seeing the people who are in the work with you, or people who are saying, I care about this too. And you feel less alone or less afraid, and you feel a lot more hopeful. And so I want to affirm everything that has been said already. We have an amazing lineup of panelists that reflect the values of GCC, of this church, that you don't have to divorce your head from your heart and your soul, that all of these things encompass a whole being faith. And so I'm going to invite our panelists to come forward. Two of them you know pretty well already. So we're going to have William come up here and sit down. Danielle Parrish, our preacher for today, thank you so much. The other two panelists, I'm going to give a brief bio on, and the only reason it's brief is because if I went into the litany of amazing things they are working on, we would be here for like, I don't know, another 8 hours or so. So first up is Suzanne Jones, who is a dear friend from our sister church in Montclair Presbyterian Church. Suzanne, come on up and sit down. She has served as a science policy analyst at Princeton University and Cal. She's spent over 20 years helping to protect natural habitats from overdevelopment, and is a leader within her own congregation on climate care. And a familiar face to us all, Jeff Reimer, who is a current elder here at First Pres, and a professor at Cal for over 40 years with research focused on environmental protection, and received the university's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2004. He's actually just returned to us from several weeks in Europe, meeting, consulting, discussing, just being in the work on this very issue. So we're so glad to have you here as well, Jeff. And so since we haven't heard too much yet from Suzanne and Jeff, we are going to give them the floor for a bit of an extended introduction, and then we're going to delve into the conversation piece of it all. So Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Will and Danielle, thank you so much for your words. Kamal, thank you for bringing Sojourner and your brothers and sisters with us. Thank you. Let's see here. 5 minutes to cover the status of climate change. So that's a little bit of a task. Let's start with a period in time that's near to your heart, which is the time of Christ. So on this graph shows the concentration of carbon dioxide, or CO2, in the atmosphere as a function of year going from the time of Christ to the present day. You probably can't really tell, but way at the top of the graph at 415, that's where the concentration of CO2 is today. Now, some of you may think the world began 5,000 years ago, and if that's the case, no shame, just saying, here's the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere since 5,000 years ago. And I can add to that then a more anthropological viewpoint, that is, how long has it been since Homo sapiens appeared? And the consensus of anthropologists is about 200,000 years. The ancestors of Homo sapiens are long before that, but most agree about 200,000 years ago is where Homo sapiens began. And now you can see on that graph the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Let's see if I can do this. No, I can't. That's all right. You can see it well. You see the arrow, that's 200,000 years ago. And you see that we've seen two trends in which the CO2 concentration was low. Those are the ice ages. And maybe some of you who are old enough with gray hair like mine remember back in the day that there were magazine covers talking about how the world had to prepare for the next ice age. Because if you look at that graph, you'll see we're near the apex and headed down. And of course, we're not. Let's take the past 800,000 years or so. So this is concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as a function of time going back 800,000 years. These data come from entrained bubbles of air that are trapped in ice cores and tree rings and rocks. So if you look back, you recognize that we are in truly unprecedented times in terms of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And that's in the background of this 800,000 years of cycles of ice ages, all of which have to do with geological and oceanographic phenomena that take my course at Cal and you could learn a lot more about. But in the meantime, that's where we are, okay? So how is it conceivable that human beings could change the atmosphere? And this is one example to just remind you that in the year 2017, if you look at the CO2 that came just from coal-fired power plants, it was about 1,400 million tons of CO2, just from coal-fired power plants. That doesn't include automobiles, it doesn't include natural gas, it doesn't include cement and steel and other sources. That same year, the world production of plastics was about 344 million tons. That is to say, we put 4 times as much carbon into the air as in all the plastics produced in 2017, just from coal-fired power plants. So yes, my friends, we do it, and we do change the atmosphere. And the connection between combustion and the CO2 in the atmosphere is established by a number of protocols that scientists have worked up over the years. There really isn't any doubt that the CO2 comes from us. So to be brief, the atmosphere is changing because we're using it as the waste receptacle for our carbon. The waste largely comes from combustion. The last thing which I'll just say briefly is, well, what does that mean? That means the planet is warming. And to understand that, it's simple for me to say, broadly speaking, very technically detailed, but the sun is a big light bulb, and the earth is a light bulb. We radiate into space, and the sun radiates into space. And one of the most cherished aspects of science, the conservation of energy, says that this is this delicate balance. Sunshine shines on us to make us warmer. We shine into space to cool us off, and that balance leaves a planet that you and I have grown accustomed to, say, in the past 800,000 years. Introduction of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, principally, are like an earth shade. That is to say, a small window of energy is blocked because of those gases in the air. And that means we're out of balance with the conservation of energy. And that balance is maintained by the planet warming up so that energy in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum dominate. So this is called radiative forcing. How big is it? Okay, so take a 6-watt light bulb, hold it over a meter of land, and that's the magnitude of what's called radiative forcing. That's the magnitude of what has happened with our CO2 in the atmosphere. Not much. But over the many, many, many square meters of the Earth, and over time, that winds up warming our planet. And that's where we're at, and there are consequences. The consequences are measured now. When I started doing this research, they largely were predicted on the basis of mathematical models. Now they're measured. Average temperature is rising. You know this. Inequality is rising. Did you know that? Well, think about it for a minute. If the planet warms and you're farming in the northern parts of the latitudes, your farm productivity goes up and your economic production goes up. Alas, if you're near the equator, your economic production goes down because it's too hot. And so there's a built-in mechanism to enforce economic inequality, measured, not mathematically calculated. Ocean levels are rising and warming. You know about this. We're already committed to 12 feet of ocean rise in the next 100 years or so. If we don't do anything to change our behavior, that's 75 feet. And I mentioned that number, fellow El Cerritans, you'll hang out the Elevation 66 pub. That's at 9 feet underwater in the year 2100. So yes, we are looking at rising ocean levels. The glaciers are retreating. I mentioned to Pastor Charlene a few minutes ago, I was just at a glacier in France where I visited every year for some 25 years. It's now a 1 kilometer walk to the front of the glacier. And when I started, I was right at the glacier when I got off the train. So glaciers are retreating. Behavior is changing. I won't go into too many details. Measured. Ocean currents changing. I'll say something about that in a minute. Ice on the Arctic's declining. You know that the Arctic will be ice-free in your lifetime. Extreme weather, obviously increasing. Biological consequences are enormous. I'm not a biological scientist. I'm a physical scientist by training, and I'm not really qualified to talk to you about biology. But if you ask anyone who works close to the land, people who fish for a living, people who farm for a living, Native Americans, they will tell you they have seen the lands change. To them, the biological consequences of climate change are not hypothetical, they're not analytical, they're a real part of their lives. And of course, it's mathematical models that allow us to go forward in the future with the confidence of looking back at old data, to look forward to the future and make predictions about things like sea level rise. So, you have to think about climate change not as an apocalypse, think of it as a cancer that slowly eats away the parts of your body. And it's interesting how we all become accustomed to losing a part of our body, as has happened, as you probably know, with cancer patients. An organ is taken away and they're put on a machine. And that becomes the new normal, which is okay, because they're still alive and with us. And then there are more machines and more machines. And we think about climate change in that context. It's taking this veiled Garden of Eden, which Will mentioned, and transforming it into a Babel, step by step by step and slowly. And that's the kind of climate change I work in, I think about it, and I do studies in. But what keeps me up at night, this is what Tom asked me, what keeps me up at night? And the answer is tipping points. And I'll close with that comment. If you ever play the game Jenga, you know you have this stack of blocks, and you have to pull the blocks out one at a time to keep it from collapsing. A tipping point is when you pull out that last block and the whole thing falls down. A tipping point is when the system no longer is recoverable to where it was before. It's completely taken apart, and going back is not possible. That's called a tipping point. And there's been considerable speculation and discussion in the scientific community of what kind of tipping points exist for climate change, and do we need to be worried about those? Because when we reach a tipping point, no matter what we do with our behavior, no matter what we do, it's not going back to where it was. So this paper came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago that has called on some attention in the media, not enough attention. It was a paper asking, what do we know about tipping points in the world, and what should we be worried about? So the top half of this figure shows a few of the places on the planet that are considered to be potential tipping points. So for example, you can see the Amazon rainforest. We lose that rainforest, it's not going to come back, and the consequences are global, right? If we lose the boreal permafrost, that northern part of Siberia and Canada, we lose that, we're not coming back. And it's a great deal of speculation as to what those tipping points are. The bottom graph, by the way, shows regional tipping points. That is, if something happens with regard to climate change, with regard to the lower latitude reefs, they're gone, and they're not going to come back. So this was the subject of this paper. And what I'm worried about, and I'll just say this briefly, I know Charlene's worried, I'll just say this briefly. There's this enormous flow of water that comes from the lower latitudes that's warm. It comes up between Africa and North America, and it evaporates and densifies the salt, and it goes down underneath and circulates back down. And that's this Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. It's millions of cubic meters of water per second. Right? A cubic meter is about the size of the organ. Okay? So millions of those every second. It's a major part of our climate world. So this paper came out in 2018 in which the authors said, let's do a mathematical calculation and estimate if that current slows down, what are the consequences? One of the consequences was temperature changes. And so on the left-hand side of this figure is a mathematical model of how the temperatures change if this thing slows down. On the right-hand side is satellite data. And you see there's a remarkable coincidence between the two, and it suggests that mathematical models and temperature measurements lead us to suggest we're turning down this current. Well, then another paper came out a few years later, and the details are not important. These are 5 graphs that are proxies for how fast this current is flowing. And you see all the proxies show it's slowing down. So the model suggested, the satellite data affirm it, and these proxy data all lead to the same conclusion. That is, this incredibly important current is slowing down, and it has consequences. So for example, on the top-hand side of this graph in the red is the temperature in that region just off the Canada coast. And in the bottom part in blue is the flow rate in this particular current, measured near Labrador. You see that on the curve. And a consequence of this current slowing down are more flooding in the East Coast and increased storms in Europe. So these are now measured, and they suggest a tipping point. So I conclude by just saying that what did this paper say? What this paper said was, let's evaluate on the planet the status of these tipping points. Look with me, please. At the bottom, you'll see the global warming thresholds. That is the temperature the planet is at. And we are on the left-hand one, less than 2 degrees. And you see 2 to 4 degrees and greater than 4 degrees. Those orange dots, the authors argue, with statistical analysis, that we are at or very close to the tipping point. And you can see there are 6 of them, not the least of which is the Labrador Sea subpolar gyre, which I just mentioned, Barrett's sea ice, the western Antarctic ice sheet collapse. So we are at the tipping point for these items, and there's no going back once we've tipped them. That's what keeps me up at night, are the tipping points. I just will say that how do I cope with this as a Christian? How do I imagine how to conduct myself and make advice to my brothers and sisters in Christ? Well, I look to the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm not going to go through that right now because I really want Suzanne to have the floor. But maybe later on in the discussion you can ask me, and how does the Good Samaritan fit into this? Thanks a lot. Now let Suzanne please come forward.
Thank you so much. Woo, there's a step there. Thank you so much for having me today. My name's Suzanne Jones, and I'm just pleased and so honored to be with this fantastic group of people doing good work in this world. I'm here today to share with you what is my greatest passion, and that is putting our faith into action to preserve this miracle of a planet that God has given us. I'm with Montclair Presbyterian Church, and a little over a year ago, we passed, our congregation adopted a climate call to action. And I'm going to talk to you about what we've done over the past year to implement that, although I'm actually only going to be talking about one part of 8 different parts of things that we are doing to try to address this problem. And really nothing could get us off the dime like what Jeff just told us about, right? The Christian call to climate action is why I'm here. I've been at this for about 30 years, and I want to start with a little bit of scripture. Hello? Well, it made my first slide disappear, but it's not making my second one up here. Down. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. Okay, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so starting with Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. That pretty much sums up why I'm still in this after all of these years. Since I was a small child, I have felt the presence of God most strongly in nature through plants and animals and being outdoors. That is really where the divine has spoken to me. It is a precious gift from God, and I feel compelled to honor it and protect it. So that's the first motivation. The second is I now have an 18-year-old son, And after what we just saw that Jeff told us about and what we've heard today, I am honestly extremely frightened for his future and for the future of all the young people today who are facing a very different world from the one that we grew up in. I need to be able to look my son in the eye and tell him honestly that I did everything I could to leave him and young people a livable and a healthy planet. So that's why I'm here. So what does that mean for us as people of faith? I really think James said it well, or James 2:14-18 says it well. This is just an excerpt. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And so a question for us is, what are the works that we need to do right now to address this problem? I'm going to talk to you about three sort of pillars of what we see as most urgent. Number one is protecting strong democratic institutions and voting rights. Number two is enacting swift and bold policies to phase out fossil fuels. And number three is reducing our individual carbon footprints, and very importantly, spreading the good news of what we are doing as we do that, so that we lead by example. So first of all, protecting democracy. I've given a lot of talks about climate change over the last 30 years. And 10 years ago, I never would have imagined that I'd have a slide about this, but that's where we are. It's very hard to imagine us, first of all, the scale of what we have to do to address the problems that have been outlined today is so vast, both in its scope, physical scope, and its time frame, the rapidity with which we need to accomplish this enormous task of decarbonizing our economy. It's very hard to imagine actually carrying that out effectively without a functioning democratic system. We need to be able to have rigorous policy debates. We need to hear different voices and have space to listen to and meet the needs of a wide variety of people and stakeholders with different needs, many of whom have been left out of that conversation up until now, which is a large part of why we're in this mess. And then we need to adopt evidence-based policies by duly elected decision makers who we trust are there because we put them there. And so in order to have these things, they all depend on voting access for all Americans. They depend on high levels of voter participation, and they depend on acceptance of the results of elections by all sides. These are things right now that are in danger. There are voter suppression efforts going on around the country, and as we know, there are many people actually seeking power who do not accept the basic premise that we have an election system that functions properly. And so at Montclair Presbyterian Church, we've done a tremendous amount of work over the last year to try to address this problem. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The second thing that I mentioned is rapid adoption and implementation of decarbonization policies on a vast scale. I don't think this was said before, but what we need to do is cut globally our greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030, it's only 7 years away, and completely be carbon neutral by 2050. This is just an enormous task requiring all our efforts, and it's up to us to put the pressure on our leaders to take the actions that are needed to make this happen. We are finally making some progress, which is amazing. We just, many of you know, I'm sure, passed the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level. That gets us quite a good distance to where we need to be in 2030, so it's a huge amount of progress. And then just in August, the California legislature passed 40 new bills that are aimed at addressing the climate crisis. This happened because their constituents demanded it. It happened because of people like William and the work that he's doing, getting out onto the streets and on the steps of the Capitals, saying, we need change now. So that is our job, and that's the progress that we're making is because people have been really doing that. So at Montclair Presbyterian Church, as an example, back in July of 2021, when we started implementing our climate call to action, one of the areas that we decided to work in was policy and democracy. And so since we began, our congregation, and I'm talking about 100 people who've been involved in this, we have taken, and actually that number is now out of date, it's 13,025 actions to protect our democracy and our climate. This is individuals in the church who are taking action on a weekly basis. We are writing postcards to voters in states where there are voter suppression attempts to give them the information they need to vote and cast their ballot. We are writing letters to our congresspeople, to the president, to senators, to demand passage of both voting rights legislation as well as climate action legislation. We have written now over 10,000 of these communications. We also make calls. We're doing canvassing coming up for the midterm elections to voters to provide that voting information. We do this on a nonpartisan basis, but what we do is we target people who are left out of this voting process. So this is largely people of color, young people, low-income people who don't necessarily have the information that they can use to get to the polls. We want to get that information to them. We've also done almost 2,400 letters, phone calls, et cetera, to our elected officials urging both climate action and actually voting rights legislation. So this tree that you see here, when we first started out, one of the young people in our congregation, who's a terrific artist, created what we call our thermometry. You know those thermometers that you use to track your fundraising goal? Well, she drew a tree for us. The actual size of this thing is about 6 feet tall. It was not painted in at all. It was just an outline. And every 2 weeks, I'd give her an update on how many actions we had taken, and she would paint her way up the tree. As of about last week, we topped 12,000 actions, which is the point. So the tree is full grown now. And we decided we have more time till the election, and so we've upped our goal to 15,000 actions by November the 8th. And so we feel really great about this because this legislation that is finally getting adopted is in part because of this kind of work, and it's going on all around the country, and everyone can be a part of it. The other thing that we can do, which this was the third thing that I talked about at the beginning, is reducing our individual carbon footprints. This chart shows you why there is such a moral imperative on Americans to engage in this process. These show the annual per capita greenhouse gas emissions in tons of greenhouse gases, CO2 equivalent per year by world region. And if you compare the average American who's responsible for the emission of 18 tons of carbon, or greenhouse gas rather, per year, to the average resident of sub-Saharan Africa who's responsible for 1 ton, it speaks for itself. We are the dominant causers of this problem, and I think it's incumbent on us to lead the solutions and make the sacrifices that are needed to put this right to the extent that we can. I also list Montclair, California, which is where my church is. As you see, the average Montclair resident is responsible for 32 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. This is a proxy for any relatively affluent person. More affluent people drive more, travel more, have larger homes, have second homes. All of these things contribute to their per capita greenhouse gas emissions. So because I don't have a whole lot of time, I wanted to give a few ideas for some of the things that you can do if you want to reduce your carbon emissions. So here are some ideas. A really easy one is to enroll in 100% renewable electricity. This takes like 5 minutes. Whether you're a PG&E customer or an East Bay Community Energy customer or MCE, some of us on the other side of the hill, all you do is call them up or log in and you click on a button that says, I would like all of my electricity to come from renewable sources. This is driving demand for renewable energy right here in California and in the West. It costs a little bit more per year, something like $40 to $50 extra per year on your electricity bill. But by doing that, right off the bat, you cut your carbon emissions by 1 ton per person in your household. Another thing you can do is adjust your diet. It turns out that foods from ruminant animals, that means cows, sheep, goats, because of their digestive system, I won't get into all of that, are responsible for a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So by cutting out or cutting back significantly on red meat and dairy products, you can reduce your carbon emissions, your personal carbon emissions, by over 1 ton. If you go completely to a plant-based diet, you can get close to 2 tons per year. One of the things that our church has done is we have produced a climate-friendly cookbook. It's a fundraiser also for our democracy and politics work, so if you're interested in all, it's got lots of resources and recipes, and I have some copies here if that's something that you want to try. Huge one, replace that gas car with an electric car as soon as you're able to do it. Just doing that right now reduces your greenhouse gas emissions by 4 tons per car. That's going to get better and better as we transition our electricity supply to more and more carbon neutral sources. And then the really big one and tough one for those of us like myself who love to travel, those long distance flights are really the dominant contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. By skipping one round trip transatlantic flight, you avoid 5 tons of emissions by just that one, day that you spend in the air, basically. So to the extent that you can, I mean, sometimes we can't avoid it, but to the extent that you can plan a vacation more locally, that can make a huge difference. I want to give one example of my church. We had planned a retreat in Spain, and in thinking about this, we were going to send 20 people to Spain. That would have been 100 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. We decided not to go to Spain, and instead we're holding a retreat which actually it's a 4-part retreat, it's really great, at Mission San Antonio de Padua nearby. And we've had a wonderful time. So, just that one choice reduced those emissions by 100 tons. If the average American did only these 4 things, it would cut their emissions by more than half. So it's great to do this stuff. It's part of a spiritual practice and leading a moral life. But it's so important that when we do them, we share the good news of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and talk to our friends, our neighbors, our family about how excited we are about the way in which we are caring for God's creation. That makes it, we lead by example, that makes it contagious, and it grows and spreads. And we have to do this on a vast scale. So if you're interested in finding out more, a good place to start would be our website. There's just a list of a whole bunch of things and resources you can click on, lots of different ways to get involved and lots of different places to help. Where there is action, there is hope. Thank you so much.
I mean, one right after another, from the sermon to Will's presentation to that 1-2 punch right there. Woo! Okay, just like processing all of this information. One of the things I appreciate about GCC is that, well, first of all, I love the metaphor that it's not the apocalypse, it's a cancer. And so how are we surgical about these issues and not just, okay, the world's ending, but there's hope. That was a perfect example of what you were talking about for imagination in the face of these things. And so what I've appreciated about GCC is that the conversation isn't just that racism exists or racial injustice exists. Right now, we're not having the conversation that climate that climate care needs to be happening, but how and what are the impacts of it. But sometimes to get at the core of these conversations means really getting surgical and naming how we got here. Okay, and so even from a scriptural level, loved what you did today when you took that Genesis passage and you were like, by the way, dominion does not mean this. So there are things in our spiritual, theological DNA that have gotten us to this point. So in your area, in your scope, maybe even just one clear example of how we got here, an assumption, a belief, a habit or something that is going to ping something in all of us. You want to start, Will?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely. I can start. I think in my mind, the biggest thing is what's called Platonic dualism, and it means the split between the physical and the spiritual. This is part of our Western worldview that we've inherited, and is so much a part of our faith. We think that the spiritual things are more important. That is what we focus on, and we focus on ourselves very individually. And the things of this world are going to fall away, and they aren't as important, which is not what the Bible says at all, which is not what Jesus practiced. And so that idea that we are somehow split, the spiritual and the physical, has really done a lot of damage theologically and to our worldview. And so I think we need to look to those who have done a lot better job of keeping those two together. We need to look away from these Western worldviews and more towards an indigenous worldview of those who have a sense of place and have a sense of spirit and sacredness and who have taken care of the earth for generations. And this report came out that saying indigenous people care for 80% of Earth's biodiversity. And so looking towards these life-giving and holistic worldviews which Christianity, originally was and has really shied away from. I think that is something we can do to infuse new life into our faith and into our actions, because it's not something non-Christian that we're doing. We're not going outside of our faith to do this. It is a part of our faith that oftentimes has been lost or co-opted. And to get back to that, I think would be a number one step.
Amen. Yeah, anyone else jump in?
Is this on? Okay, great. How did we get here? And Charlene, are you interested in how we got here as a species, or more how we got here as Christians?
I mean, take your pick, and oftentimes they can be the same answer, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think as Christians, part of the problem is what we talked about earlier, which is just there are some confusing messages in that Genesis passage that really can be interpreted in a number of ways. So as Christians, I feel like in a way it's set us on this course. It's also the case, though, that we see this happen. This is a relatively new thing in the history of our species. We've just become dependent on agriculture 10, 12,000 years ago. And I think at that moment, we made this transition, understandably trying to care for our own needs and our families and be healthier and have security. I think that was a big part of what led us. God gave us these incredible brains, and we wanted to figure out how can we eliminate as much of that insecurity and uncertainty in our lives as possible. But in the process, we pulled ourselves away from our true home, which is where we had spent the first 200,000 years, not in nature, but nature. We are nature, right? I mean, even in the beginning of my talk, I said, I feel most with God when I'm in nature, as though that's like a separate thing, because we have pulled ourselves away. So I think it's part of like remembering that we are actually part of the animal kingdom. We are, part of this incredible miraculous web of life, and it's that separation and pulling away that we've done that has made us sort of lose that connection. So, thanks.
Yeah. So the traveler is lying nude on the side of the road, stripped of everything, and the robbers did this. That was subjugation. That was maybe indulging in their desire to have more consumption. So we are the robbers, right? We're doing this. We did this to the traveler. And the Levite and the priest, they walk by this guy on the side of the road. And as a child, I always thought, well, they were evil, they were sinful, they were bad. But actually, as I understand it now, the priest and the Levite were just part of the culture. They were part of the system. And walking by the naked traveler was not an evil thing to do. It was part of the cultural norm, part of the position they had in society about how they would deal with what they may have thought was a dead body. So we're the priest and the Levite too, aren't we? We're the religious elite who have our own cultural rules, and we bypass this earth which is so wounded. And we're the Levites, especially me, right? With my grants and my papers and the lectures and all this big intellectual and cultural power, but I'm walking right by the earth that's naked lying on the ground. So we're the priests, we're the Levites, and we're the robbers. That's how I see how we got here.
I spent a lot of time in the ancient Near East, and I study a little bit their archaeology, historical geography, how to understand this book originally. And it's very clear that in the biblical time period, everybody knew how to reduce, reuse, recycle, because the way that you lived was just sort of on the edge of survival. And you can hear it in the text, like, God send us rain in its season. Don't send it when it's not supposed to come, send it when it's supposed to come. And if you don't, then it's because we've been unfaithful. So there's so much understanding of how we were connected to the world that we lived in and the resources that we had as a result of our faithfulness, as the way in which God cared for us, as the way in which we cared for our neighbor. And even when you read in the book of Genesis how Abraham welcomes the visitors, you can go, oh, what a weird thing, where he just sort of welcomes these people wandering by. But it's because everybody needed to welcome everyone, otherwise you died, right? So we used to live in a community, in a culture, in a society where our relationship to the land and our relationship to one another was essential and also fragile. And there was an awareness that we were not the creator, but the created ones. Once we started the Industrial Revolution, we started getting in our own boxes, and once cars became a box where then we could just go to another box, and then we could get back in our box and come back to another box and get in another box, and we stopped relating with the creation. I think we stopped relating with one another and with our Creator. And then it's very easy to just think, yeah, it doesn't really matter if I have plastic, or it doesn't really matter if I have a car. I want the biggest car, even though I don't need an SUV, or whatever it might be. The consumerism doesn't even knock on our hearts, or the impact of our choices doesn't even register as a problem because we're so divorced from nature itself. Barbara Brown Taylor wrote a beautiful book called An Altar in the World. I think if we could all just lay down on the floor of a forest and just be there for some time. And I know us pastors like to preach on, but I have this beautiful, I don't know if you guys have it, the Green Bible. Harper Collins put it out some time ago. And they have these lovely quotes. And there's a quote here from Meister Eckhart, 12:16. He said, "If I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon. So full of God is every creature." I think that's true. And I think we've just lost it. Yeah.
So I see a unifying theme, and actually there was a conversation around this communion table this morning around rampant individualism, right? This need, I mean, it comes from honestly this fear, and I need to get secure. It starts in that place, and then it just becomes take what I need, no matter the cost, and then to the point where it becomes so normalized we don't even see it, right? The dualism, just it's our worldview. And as has been the case, honestly, with some of these GCC topics, the issues become pressing enough that we cannot ignore them. There are plenty of people who are here, I'm looking at you, Sherry, who are like, we should have been talking about this decades ago, right? And now no one has the luxury of ignoring these things. But I do want to get to your own personal story of how it invaded your space. So I'll even share a little bit of mine. 2 years ago exactly, I was a resident of New York City. I was a renter. I did not see my water bill, right? It just comes in rent. You just pay that one lump sum and that's it. So, your kids can take the shortest bath, longest bath. You can run the dishwasher 10 times a day, 0 times a day. It doesn't matter. You don't see that water bill. I see my water bill now, right? And it in a very individual sense, I feel the connection to these things because it has impacted my individual lane and world. And sometimes that's how the change starts, right? So for you as individuals, like when did this become a thing where you're like, I can't ignore it anymore? And again, anyone, just pick up that mic.
And climate change or creation care? Sorry, I have a question for the questioner every time.
I mean, both, either.
Yeah. Well,
and is it not?
Yeah.
Is that not a part of the same?
right.
Epiphany?
It's certainly part of the same, but I guess temporarily they might have happened at different times.
Okay.
But for me as a child, I grew up here in the East Bay. I remember the moment where like creation care clicked for me. And that was when I learned about the slaughter of whales in the ocean. And as a 10-year-old, I saw the images. I couldn't believe that we were doing this. I read about blue whales and how they're the largest creature on Earth. And at that time, they were functionally extinct. It turns out there were a few out there, and they are making a little bit of a comeback. But this just blew me away. And from that moment on, really, I was an activist. I organized my school, and we did the walkathons with Greenpeace in Golden Gate Park. And so that was really the moment. But then so I was involved with things, off and on throughout my childhood and teen years. But then when I got to college and I first read about this CO2 problem, I had this wave of terror pass over me because suddenly everything that I loved was in danger. And really since then, it's been on my mind. And I mean, I was telling Jeffrey earlier, like those slides that he showed, I don't really go there anymore. It scares me too much. So I keep that at arm's length. It's in the back of my mind enough so that every morning I get up and I do what I can about this problem, and I'm like very passionate about it. But if I dwell on that, I get too scared. So that's my experience. Thanks.
Okay, how did I get here? Maybe some of you have had this experience. I was fortunate enough as a teenager to be a backpacker. And in those days before, the gray hair is starting to show. In those days, you could go to the Sierras and drink water right out of the stream. And the connection with nature, as your ancient Christian monk noted, the connection with nature was so powerfully visceral in those days. That's when I decided that professionally, as a scientist and an engineer, I would focus my work on things that would mitigate human damage to the environment. But it was really that connection with nature, for me personally, that drew me here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was born and raised and currently live down the street from a refinery in Torrance. I didn't realize growing up in school it's not normal to have your air poisoned and to have to shelter in place when gas escapes and to have gas flaring. And when I was away in Humboldton College, the refinery actually exploded. And so this fear for my family and friends back home, and it was a near disaster. It uses hydrofluoric acid, and if that tank had been hit, my home is in the kill zone of that. And so I was lucky enough to take environmental science AP in high school. I learned all about our climate crisis. I learned all about environmental and climate justice and what was happening, around us. And I learned about the refinery, which I could see out the back of my classroom. It was a block away, and it was the backdrop of our stadium. And so that, I really think, spurred me into action, was seeing not just the effects of climate change, but the effects of fossil fuel infrastructure and the danger and health effects to the community around it. And we also have lots of oil drilling in the neighborhoods near me as well. And those are just in the immediate area. We also have, there's 2 Superfund sites near my house, and within 8 miles of my house, there's about 6 or 7 refineries down in Southern California. And so this isn't a small problem, it's a big one because it's so dense. There's so many people who live there and often who don't know the dangers. And so I was lucky enough to be educated about it. But I have to keep a gas mask in my closet now, living by the refinery in case another disaster happens.
I shared a little bit during the sermon today that I think watching my parents in their 70s having to flee flames, right? That activates you in a way that you maybe weren't as active before. But I also had the privilege of growing up in a lot of nature in Northern California. And so one of my spiritual directors was Susan Phillips here at New College, Berkeley. And when you go through some of those practices and they say, like, if you close your eyes and you're trying to connect to God, it's always a redwood grove for me, because that's where I grew up. But there's a particular color of the new growth on the edge and of those trees, and I just would lay on the floor of those forests and look up and always feel very much connected to God and creation. I also had the Greenpeace sweatshirt in college and, the Birkenstocks and the Save the Planet t-shirt in high school. But honestly, I think it's, something I've voted for and paid attention to as an individual. And now I'm here with a bit of shame that it took me so long to become as activated as I am now, because the suffering that we're seeing here is nothing compared to what's been experienced for several decades by so many. And so I'm here now. So if you feel late to the game, it's okay. You can come sit with me. We'll sit with our grief and shame. I'm sort of joking. We're not going to sit with grief and shame. We live resurrection-shaped lives as Jesus followers, and so we're going to sit with hope. And hope demands a resurrected-shaped life. For me means that I stand at the tomb expecting death, but instead I'm greeted with life.
It's beautiful, thank you. I think that the whole apocalypse metaphor, or maybe not so much metaphor, in some ways it's easier for humanity to sit with than a cancer, because it's like, that's out of my hands, that's coming. Whereas cancer is, there are things that we can do to mind our body, to mind our health, to intervene, if you will. So to that end, I mean, I feel like there is this feeling there is this thing in the water that's like, what can I do? And so that slide that you put up with the tons, like, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, okay. I saw my mom laughing about the transatlantic flight thing. What are the biggest misconceptions that individuals come into this? Like, what can I, like, the damage has been done. I mean, maybe in their minds, even to the tipping point phraseology that you use, Jeff, like we're past the point of no return. And so what are some of those big misconceptions that we're operating with that keep people from just changing any of their lifestyle? Thank you.
Well, I think one misconception of it is that it's all or nothing. It's not all or nothing. Every 10th of a degree makes a difference to a person, a species, an area. So we are fighting for every 10th of a degree, every 100th of a degree, and every bit helps. So it's important that we don't think like in those apocalyptic terms that, oh, it's all out of my hands, we can't do anything about it. You know, I often think, you know, our faith does not solve this problem, but our faith does solve this problem if we put it into action. And that's why we have faith, right? Like what James tells us, is that it's there for a purpose. It's for us to be the hands, the feet, the eyes, the ears of God in the world. And that's really, I think, all we can do is do our best and fight for every 10th of a degree because it matters to somebody. So.
Yeah, I think another misconception that I hear from friends and colleagues all the time is that what I do has to be perfect. So you can't buy an electric car because there's CO2 associated with the production of that car. We can't use windmills because they kill birds. We can't use solar because they're all made in China. China, right? And it's that kind of mentality is stupefying, and it really disables. The answer is we're going to need leadership from the Christian church to make tough decisions that involve compromises to get 100th of a degree, a 10th of a degree, and make it so. And none of these solutions for alternative energy in particular are free of problems, right? But we have to move, and we have to move really, really quickly now. And if you want to indulge in techno-triumphalism, as engineers and scientists are often want to do, then you can say, yes, the lithium-ion battery is really great now, but the next thing will not have the impact of cobalt from Africa. The next thing, but we need to move quickly, my friends, or we're going to be in a very difficult situation. The Christian church can do that. It can mobilize and move. And if I may, Charlene, just one thing, because I haven't talked about the Samaritan yet, right? Because we are also all the Samaritans, right? We have intent, we have liquidity, that is, we have money to spend today, and we have assets. We give up a little of those like the Samaritan did, the oil and the money for the innkeeper. And the Samaritan gave up assets too, promised the innkeeper to come back later and pay the bills. Christian brothers and sisters, we can do this. Intent, liquidity, and assets are available to all of us with Suzanne and any other of these great ideas that'll work. I bought one of her books today with my liquidity, okay? You can do the same, right?
Yeah, I think one of the big misconceptions, and I will say specifically in the Christian world, is, I get the question, is this the end times? And people, sometimes they're afraid to say it, sometimes they're very bold, and there's nothing we can do. They quote 2 Peter, the earth is going to burn up. And if you keep reading that verse, it says the earth was destroyed during Noah's flood, and yet here we are. And so sometimes there's no changing their mind out of that, and they're resigned to not do anything. But I will have to pose the question to them, and I'll use this cancer analogy, is that when your loved one is diagnosed with a terminal illness, and there's no treatments, or you're trying different ones, you get this diagnosis. Do you just give up? And do you just say, well, there's nothing we can do. They're going to pass away anyway. Why bother trying? No, that's ridiculous. You do everything possible for your loved one. And even when the end comes, you're sitting by their bed, holding their hand, and you are doing your best to ease the suffering. And so even if everything was decided and there was no changing it, I don't think I would act any differently than I do now. Because as people of faith, that is what we are called to do. That in the face of death and suffering, we are there to provide hope and life.
I think somebody asked Martin Luther, if you knew Jesus was coming back tomorrow, what would you do? And he said, plant a tree. Right? So we still do the next right thing. And I think it is very easy. I resonate with getting overwhelmed and falling into a little bit of that, what can we do? And so I think to know yourself and to know what it is you can do and to be disciplined in holding something at arm's length, if necessary, so that you can keep doing the next right thing in those bits of steps. So I think sometimes it can feel just way overwhelming. And I found turning off the news, that doesn't mean you don't care, right? It's not that you stop acting, but if you know that that's more detrimental and it's pulling you back from being able to act and to be able to care and extend for that. The second thing I think is centering these marginalized voices, because it's a lot of privilege to say, it's too hard for me. But if we are the global church and we really do care for our sisters and brothers around the world, we have to very much listen.
To quote your Meister Eckhart, one of the things he also said was, if the only prayer we ever pray is thank you, that would be enough. And so for my experience coming from New York and having the privilege and the honor of living in a place that increasingly is harder and harder to live in, and not just because of climate change, but because of the cost of living, this area, I've become so appreciative of nature. And from that place, like what you were talking about, Jeff, in gratitude of nature, it makes me want to protect it all the more. And so starting from this place of gratitude versus shame, there is a lot to be terrified over and enraged about, and also to be able to look at that caterpillar, to be able to look out at the trees and realize what a blessing this was intended to be. By God, and then how do we continue that blessing for generations to come is a great honor and responsibility for us all. So I feel very informed. I feel like there was an open invitation at the beginning of your piece, Jeff, that we can audit your class, yes? I heard that. I don't know if anyone else heard that. I feel very encouraged and informed and also emboldened to do the next right thing, to quote Frozen 2. For those of you who are familiar with Frozen 2. I was like, where did I hear that quote? Oh, right. Anna from Frozen 2. All right, folks, your panelists are going to be around afterwards. I want to be mindful of how generous you have been with your time, and so they're going to stick around and be in conversation. Also, be in conversation with one another. Share your stories and your experiences, the things, the pockets of your world in which you are feeling anxiety or hope, where you are taking action or where you're looking for action. The answers are within this community as well. I'm certain of it. Also, we have cookies outside, right? No, do we? Yes, there are cookies. Cookies for climate care and creation. That's the new acronym we're going with, cookies and culinary treats for climate care and creation. Suzanne, you can take it. I'm not trademarking it. Don't worry about it. We're going to close, though, with this really inspirational slideshow of art pieces that were created and displayed a few weeks ago. These are all local, congregant, inspired, and made art pieces to respond to themes around creation in our study of Ecclesiastes. Included in this slideshow is a mural that was created with art direction from muralist Kakoa, along with our youth director, Dave Carranza, and a whole bevy of our youth. youth contributors. It was a live mural painting and is on display outside afterwards, so you can all see it right next to the cookies. One thing is for certain, the youth are going to lead us in this endeavor. They already are. And so go see the inspiration out there and enjoy this slideshow right now. Yay. It's what? Okay, so friends, by all means, be in conversation as you enjoy this slideshow and go get cookies. There's some we'll put it on a loop so it continues to play. Thank you so much for being here.